Okay, well, welcome those who are joining in. We'll wait a few minutes before we get started right at the top of the hour. Welcome to those of you who are joining in. We'll get started at the top of the hour in just a couple minutes. We'll get started in just a minute. Great, well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the second seminar in the Data Science Coast to Coast Seminar Series. My name is Sarah Stone and I'm the Executive Director of the eScience Institute at the University of Washington. This Data Science Coast to Coast series is hosted jointly by 6 academic data science institutes distributed across the country. We convene regularly to plan ways to foster a broad-reaching data science community in service of our shared missions to accelerate data-intensive research and education on our campuses and beyond. This shared seminar is one of our first steps toward advancing these goals, allowing us to take advantage of our current remote environment and eliminate the typical geographic constraints. I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues who have been involved in jointly organizing this series. They are executive directors at data science organizations and include Kyle Cramner of the Moore Sloan Data Science Environment Initiative at NYU, Angela Wilkins of the Rice University Ken Kennedy Institute, Chris Menzel of the Stanford Data Science Initiative, David Monjo of the Berkeley Institute for Data Science, and Jing Liu of the Michigan Institute for Data Science. This fall, we are excited to be featuring prominent figures in data science. Oops, there we go. I'll just go back a second here. So this fall, we're excited to be featuring prominent figures in data science who will provide insight from really complementary perspectives on the transformative applications of data science in both traditional research disciplines, as well as other areas such as public policy and education, in support of a data-enabled and just society. As we move into the new year in 2021, we will also be featuring faculty and postdocs from across our institutes, hoping to use this seminar as a jumping off point for future discussions and collaborations across our organizations. Just want to take this opportunity to mention a few upcoming events at our institutes that might be of interest to this audience. At the University of Washington this fall, we're launching a new data science minor, and we have a launch event coming up tomorrow at 10 a.m. Pacific time, and that will feature our provost joined by various faculty and students involved in showcasing the data science research that's part of this new minor. At Berkeley, as part of an ongoing series called Berkeley Conversations, on December 8th, there'll be a talk titled COVID-19 Misinformation, Understanding and Seeking Truth During a Pandemic. Also coming up in December is the Text XD workshop. Berkeley runs a series of these XD workshops. This is focused on text analysis across domains. You can check out invited speakers, lightning talks, and a hackathon associated with this event. I'll drop the links to each of these events into the chat in just a minute. But right now I'd like to pass the mic to Andrew Connolly to introduce our speaker today. I stumbled over it because I always call him Andy, but I thought I'd be formal and say Andrew. Andy is the director of the eScience Institute at the University of Washington and a professor in the University of Washington Department of Astronomy. Over to you, Andy.
Thanks, Sarah. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Alex Szalay as the next speaker in the Data Science Coast to Coast Seminar Series. Alex is a Bloomberg Distinguished Professor in Physics and Astronomy and also the Department of Computer Science at Johns Hopkins University. He's also the founding director of one of the first data science institutes in the US, the Institute for Data Intensive Engineering and Science, or IDEAS. Alex has received numerous awards. He is a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He received the Humboldt Award in Physical Sciences. And in 2007, he was the recipient of, I believe, the first Jim Gray Award for Data Science, an award series that is sponsored by Microsoft in honor and memory of Jim Gray and all of his contributions to data science. Throughout his career, Alex has worked at the interface of big data and science, even when big data wasn't quite as impressive as it is today. In 2000, I think one of the real landmark pieces of work that Alex did was working with Jim Gray and other collaborators. Alex developed a database system for an astronomical survey called the Sloan Digital Sky Survey and made available tens of terabytes of data to the astrophysics community. And this really transformed astronomy. And in fact, it really transformed a lot of data science and the data science community, turning astronomy not just into a data science field, but also into a field of data science where any researcher could have access to the data and not just those at very well-resourced institutions. And so the transformation of SkyServer, which was the database for the Sloan Digital Sky Survey, led to over 5,000 publications in the first 5 years of operations of the SDSS, making it one of the most scientifically productive telescopes or observatories in the world. It also represented my first steps into data science, which I'm extremely grateful for. Alex is one of the most scientifically diverse researchers I know. He works on cosmology, he's worked on citizen science, on turbulence, on soil science, and now on cancer, which I think leads nicely into the title of Alex's talk. We're going to have, if you have questions as we go through this talk, please put them into the question and answer box at the bottom of the screen, and we'll address those questions when Alex completes his talk. And so I'm going to turn it over to Alex, who's going to be telling us about from sky surveys to cancer, spatial data everywhere. Alex, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so I'd like to talk about the journey over the last 25 to almost 30 years on what it took us to go from astronomy to a much broader range of data science projects. And so what we see today that the big data is more and more prevalent in science, and the data is growing exponentially. All science is becoming increasingly data-driven, and this is really happening very rapidly at an accelerating pace. And an additional challenge here is that the data is becoming also increasingly open and public, and the expectations about the open and public delivery combined with usable interfaces is actually becoming increasingly more challenging. Furthermore, as the data is growing, we can't just buy a little bit more disks every year or a little bit more computers. We actually have to change the way we do this in a non-incremental fashion, and also the way we perform the analysis in a non-incremental fashion. We also see another trend that in science, generally, it has different branches of science. They started all out with natural philosophy and gradually branched into physics, mathematics, chemistry, and so on, biology, then into computational biology, theoretical biology, and so on. So we saw this increased fragmentation and specialization in all disciplines of science. But what we see today is actually the opposite. We see a convergence of physical and life sciences into genuine multidisciplinary enterprise. And this is actually driven by big data, where the statistical and computing and the data management skills are actually overarching. They actually apply equally to all of these disciplines. The other property of the data science today, that when we say that data is growing exponentially, it is not just growing vertically, that we have some very large data sets which are now in the petabytes, but we also have billions and billions of small data sets, small files, and the whole thing is a 1/f power law distribution. So this is called the long tail. And the long tail is important, but yet up to now, it has really defied our comprehension what to do with it. So that still remains an unsolved challenge in my mind. But we live in a very special time, and even in a very special place, where the scientific revolution in how discovery takes place is changing right in front of our eyes. And this hasn't happened all that often in the history of science. So how does scientific data analysis looking today? So data is everywhere, and it is clear that the scientific data that we will need will never be at a single location. And this is true even in the case when there are the large cloud providers appearing. The data grows as fast as our computing power, because essentially it is collected through computers. And in this world, we basically need new algorithms, randomized incremental algorithms, kind of this Christ streaming. And we need to start balancing, so take into account what we call optimal, how long does it take to perform the analysis? And we may define the best result in 1 minute, 1 hour, 1 day, or 1 week. There may be problems where we need to have an approximate result in 1 minute, and it's okay to have a more accurate result in 1 week or in 1 year. And this all revolves around the trade-offs between statistical versus systematic errors. Historically, when we had data sets consisting of 100 points, then Gauss invented least-squares, and it was the statistical errors that dominated our science and limited our science. But when we have billions of data points, the square root of n of those is tiny. The 1 over root n is tiny, but the only way to collect a billion data points when we collect it from many different sources. And therefore, in each instrument that contributes to this pool of data will have slightly different instrumental characteristics. And the systematic errors, that's tiny little instrumental biases between different instruments, appear now to be or emerge as essentially the limiting factor in limiting our accuracy. There is a difference between kind of in how we do the analysis in science compared to how we do the analysis, for example, when Google is placing ads on the web. And we basically need, in science, we need both exploratory and confirmatory searches. Exploratory searches are when we detect superficial correlations between different factors. This may be good enough to place an ad to a user, but at the same time, if we want the cure for cancer, we actually want to establish a causal relationship. So based upon all those exploratory correlations, we have to perform additional experiments and additional analysis, which are kind of orthogonal, to decide which of these correlations are just by chance and which are those which reflect a genuine causal relationship. We also see that machine learning is taking off. It is not just a privilege of a few computer scientists, but it's actually machine learning is here for the masses. We also see Python emerging as a new programming paradigm, and especially within the context of Jupyter. And I still remember those days when there was an AI winter. So when the artificial intelligence was a little bit overpromised, and there was a backlash. So every proposal that had AI in its title was immediately rejected. Today, the deep learning and neural networks are not a dirty word anymore. So they are providing really genuine new insights. And they are becoming incredibly popular, exploding all over. So why is astronomy? So how come that, a lot of this effort grew out of astronomy? Why is astronomy so relevant for data science? It has puzzled me for a while until I really realized that astronomy has been traditionally been data-driven. And this is due to the fact that we cannot go into the lab and push a button and then a star goes ping on the sky. We cannot do usual reproducible lab experiments. We cannot do repeatable experiments with celestial objects. All that we can do is to watch the sky. And it took 1,000 years from when the Bethlehem star, the supernova, was seen exploding. We had to actually understand nuclear physics, statistical physics, gravity, and all that, and stellar evolution until we were actually able to interpret that this was really the end of a life cycle of a star. So this is Jim Gray talking at Microsoft and one of the first big data meetings, and also talking about how big the data for the Sloan Digital Sky Survey is going to be. And Jim spent half his time for over a decade working with us, and his annual review was conducted by Bill Gates personally. And he asked Jim, why are you spending half your time working with the astronomers? And Jim said, I love working with them because their data is so exciting because it's worthless. So, and he meant it in the best possible way, because what he meant by worthless, that we didn't need the Microsoft lawyers. We actually didn't need NDAs to share data with Microsoft and with other collaborators. And we had actually a replica of the Sloan database running inside the SQL Server group whenever we actually hit a bug, because it was during a rapid development. This SQL Server was in a rapid development cycle then. Jim immediately called it in, and within 2 days it was fixed. So it was an amazing experience, and it was a beautiful collaboration. So my involvement with data started with the Sloan Digital Sky Survey. So I was a theoretical cosmologist working on the spatial clustering of galaxies. And the Sloan project, the idea was that we started in 1992, we built a special telescope, and the big format digital detectors became available at that time. So why don't we build the telescope and the instruments and everything in 4 years, from 92 to 96, and then operate for 4 years and then cover the northern sky from the US and make it all available to the public. Well, easier said than done. The project was supposed to cost $25 million, and we actually started operating in 2001. So everything took much longer. And then we properly finished what we set out to do originally in 2008. It cost about $120 million by then. But this delay enabled us an amazing new opportunity because there was more slow and slow working in the background. So computations every 18 months doubled our computing power, and this price became a factor of 2 cheaper every year. So we could do a much more ambitious thing on actually analyzing, organizing, and presenting the data than we had any right. In 92, you know how to present a terabyte of data. So our original goals were 2.5 trillion pixels of images. In the end, we covered 5 trillion pixels of the sky. So we thought we would take about 10 terabytes of raw data. Well, we took a lot more, and plus we were able to reprocess it multiple times as we understood more and more about the telescope's systematics. And we thought that our database will be 0.5 terabyte. Today we serve up 35 terabytes, but typically we actually serve it in 6 copies for load balancing. So we serve up 200 terabytes of databases for the public. And the spectrograph was built at Johns Hopkins, and it is continuing even up to today. And so around 95, I met with Jim Gray, and it was an instant collaboration. So we started work together, and it lasted all the way until Jim disappeared. So even today, when I have a new idea, I think about Jim. So wouldn't it be wonderful to pick up the phone and kind of bounce it off of Jim? And so together we built the SkyServer, which was the database, which became the database for the Sloan survey. Originally, it was kind of a skunkworks project, but the two of us hacked it together in a couple of months. And the idea was to do an experiment out of the TerraServer that Jim was building with Tom Barkley at that time in Microsoft, where they were organizing the first imaging, publicly available imaging of the US. And we actually, the first version of our software was just turning basically this TerraServer inside out, looking out on the sky. And so by today, it's an integrated system, it's a database and a highly visual front end. So we have almost 4 billion web hits. People have typed in, so I discounted the robotic queries, so more than 500 million external queries. It generated now 9,000 plus papers and 500,000 citations. But what is amazing that there are 15,000 astronomers in the world who are professionals, but we see actually 7 million distinct users based upon IP addresses. And we saw the emergence of the internet scientist. It is even more than the citizen scientist in a sense that they are people who are technically highly sophisticated. So they are not just doing bird watching, but actually they are doing quantitative analysis. And we have actually 9,000 power users who have an account on our site, and they actually have their own server-side databases. So what we found early on that spatial information was incredibly important for astronomers. And with some of the questions we wanted to ask on the data are that what resources are in this part of the sky? What's the common area of the surveys? Is this point in the survey? Give me all the objects in this region you can imagine. And actually using spherical trigonometry is not easy. And it also turned out that using GIS software in tangent projections was not good enough. We needed much higher accuracy. So we actually stored everything as Cartesian coordinates and used the idea that a longitude and latitude line in any spherical coordinate system is the intersection of a three-dimensional plane with the sphere of the sky. So basically, we actually used three-dimensional polyhedra to define spherical polygons, and that became much cheaper computationally than doing curved space trigonometry. And we also built a highly efficient index using spherical quadtrees, kind of relying on the seminal book of Hanan Samet. And we built a spherical space-filling curve Our resolution is 15 centimeter, corresponding to 15 centimeter on the Earth. And it basically, we can do a point-in polygon search in a matter of a fraction of a second. So in 1 second, we can retrieve about 1 million objects from the database. So we have more than 200 complex geometries stored in the database, plus an additional 6 million simple geometries, which are masked areas and bright stars and so on. And the today's version of this software was built by Tamás Budavári. Originally, we wrote all this spatial geometry, spherical geometry code within T-SQL, which was easy to do with Jim. But it was still not fast enough. And so Tamás rewrote it when C# came out. And this was part of the SQL Server shrink wrap package. And this became actually the foundation of Microsoft Spatial. And this is some of the presentations. So this is how we present. So for example, every celestial object that we have detected, we also store the complex region of, so basically region of attraction, the pixels, which were used in determining the properties of the objects and so on. So you can actually navigate through the database queries even just using mouse clicks without typing anything. So the Sloan was really the beginning of the era of surveys, how the US astronomy has been transformed by large surveys, which happened over the last 20 years. So this is the happy note on surveys. There will be another note later on. So basically, these were both photometric and spectroscopic, Sloan 2DF, 2MASS, PenSTARRS, dark energy survey, hypersupreme camera, Palomar transient factory, Zwicky transient factory, LSSTW first, Euclids. So basically, all these surveys cover a large fraction of the sky, and they provide a large open access archive. And it took many years, each of them took many years to complete, hundreds of people working on it. And now the multi-wavelengths is the norm, and the data is an open and free archive. And it was a remarkably fast transition compared to other science disciplines. So astronomy really bought wholesale into the idea that surveys are good, and it is the wave of the future. So this is the new astronomy. And so this is an image of the Sloan telescope, 2.4 meter and 120 million pixels. This was PenSTARRS, 1.8 million and 1.4 billion pixels. And LSST is about going live. So the Rubin Observatory and Large Synoptic Survey Telescope is 8.4 meter and 3.2 billion pixels. But astronomy didn't stop with just collecting large observational data. Cosmological simulations, where we actually predict what the universe would look like from first principle, has been around, and they became larger and larger and more, increasingly more realistic. And there really the breakthrough happened with the Millennium database, the Millennium simulation, which was started in 2000 and finished in 2005. And it was a 30 billion particle simulation. And Herald Lemson, who was at that time at the Max Planck Institute, put it into a SQL Server database similar to the Sloan survey, except that we could look not only the present view of the universe, but we can look the past. And this has now hundreds of registered users and became basically the etalon by which everything is measured against. And today, so there are hundreds of people who are using it. It generated, again, hundreds of papers. And the data size and scalability requirements against these new databases containing simulations are growing. More and more of these new simulations are put into large databases, and we are approaching petabyte data sizes and trillions of particles. So just one that we have built recently in-house is the suite of the Indra suite of simulations, where we have 512 realizations of a medium scale gigaparsec simulation with 1 billion particles, but we have 100 time step or 128 snapshots, and altogether it adds up to 1.1 petabyte of simulation data. And with this one can study ensemble averages. So in the simulated world, there is not just one universe to observe, but we can observe actually a multitude of universes and do repeatable experiments that we cannot do in the real one. So Another area where the databases and large-scale databases made a tremendous difference is turbulence. Feynman called this the last unsolved problem of classical physics. And basically, in the mid-2000s, a colleague of mine, Charles Menebo, was running, and his students were running a 1,000-cube simulation, and they were running it for several thousand time steps. And they were putting in Lagrangian test particles, which were going with the flow and analyzing the data. But it was not converging fast enough, and it was taking too long. And so the idea was, this was the time also when the Twister movie was out, and we suddenly realized that we could just put all the snapshots, all the time steps into a big database and use a spatial index similar to what we built on the Quadtree. We were using a spatial octree, and we could generate a system where you can take your laptop anywhere in the world and just put in a bunch of, you can place your virtual particles inside the simulation, we can compute the interpolated velocity and start moving them. So we can do a twister so we can have a hurricane in your laptop. And we started out with the 30 terabyte simulation, and it was immediately an instant success with people. Then we put in later on a 50 terabyte simulation, then 100, then a 256 terabytes. So we were getting more and more daring. Today we have the world's largest turbulence simulation, at least a few time steps of it in the database. And we delivered in the last 5 years 103 trillion test points, test measurements to the community through the open interface. So this is a new metaphor. The users don't even know how many points, what is the resolution of the simulation. They put in 10,000 points at the time and then get back 10,000 velocities or 10,000 trajectories. Basically, it could be, for all they care, it could be a gigabyte or it could be several petabytes. They don't know and they don't care. And it doesn't matter because they are running their physical experiments in a virtual world. So we call this petascale numerical laboratories, but it's a new metaphor for interactivity, providing interactive access to petabyte scale data. So over the years, this process started really with Jim Gray. So we went around and realized about halfway through the Sloan project that this approach will be very relevant for other areas of science. And we started to explore how can we take the lessons learned and apply it in other areas of science. And basically, the result of this transitionary process, which took 10 years, is the SciServer. So we went from SkyServer to SciServer. This was held by an NSF DIBS grant where we got $10 million over 5 years to do this development, to take essentially a SkyServer, rip it apart into modules and separate the generic data management modules from the astronomy business intelligence, and basically rebuild the APIs in a clean fashion under the hood. And so the idea is that we provide service-oriented smart data where the data is accessible through smart APIs. We added more and more collaborative features, and we basically, the core of it is interactive access to petabytes of data. And the way we did this, that much of the high-value data sets are, like the Sloan, are read-only secure cores. You cannot change them. But on the surface, we allowed people to create their own user-owned databases. These are called MyDBs. And people have been doing increasingly complex analysis patterns. So they use these tools not as a hammer, but rather as a violin. And they started to play actually not just making sounds with it, but amazing music. So they created incredibly complex analysis patterns. And we saw an extensive use by other disciplines, from genomics to environmental science. So when Jupyter emerged, this was actually kind of so people reached the point when actually SQL scripting was not good enough, and they wanted to integrate with other resources, and Jupyter was the obvious way to go. And so we were one of the first adopters where we adopted IPython, so the Jupyter environment, and integrated it with the rest of the SciServer. And we also did a single sign-on, so all the services are actually accepting a single Kerberos ticket. And we have, so for example, the Paradigm project is a $25 million NSF material science project, which tries to build new type of transistors. And most of their software is in Python. they came to us that could we actually host their whole data management services, and within 2 weeks they were up and running and completely happy. So these are now, so this started with the Sloan project. This was the first project that we started out with. And now we basically see this is the plethora of all the different science projects, from astronomy to fluid dynamics, earth sciences, computer science, life sciences, social sciences, education, material science. We even have a HIPAA compliant core within a big firewall at the Hopkins Hospital. So in a sense, if I wanted to define today what is the SciServer, probably the best word to use would be a scalable data aggregator. In a sense, what we found that with the virtual observatory, once you have kind of catalogs like the Sloan and there is another SkyServer, another wavelengths, you want to aggregate and integrate those and perform a joint analysis. And this pops up everywhere in every area of science. So it's difficult to aggregate large data sets. The joint analysis requires co-location and also performing a join between the different data sets. The most frequent mistake that what we have seen people doing is that when they bring in a new data set, they are trying to create the mother of all databases. So they want to build a system where everything is very tightly integrated. And the problem here is that if you bring in the second data set, okay, you can build the relationships. You bring in a third one, you actually have to build the links to everyone there. So you have to build then two linkages to integrate it with two other databases. You bring in the fourth one and so on. This becomes combinatorial and it becomes untenable. And integrating the ontologies and the data models in this space is almost impossible. So the other important thing is interactivity. The real life users require interactive exploration before we all just roll up our sleeves and dig into the data before we actually push the button for the big workflows. So our philosophy is that we create this isolated data context, where each are like one is Sloan, another one is, for example, Tumas, and so on. Each of them have their own data models and ontologies, which are self-documenting and self-contained. These are secure and read-only under access control. Then the users get their own databases where they can do anything, and they can actually provide these links. They can figure out what are the join keys, they can perform these value-added data sets. And you may combine two different catalogs in two different ways if you do a different type of analysis. And they can, all these aggregations and value-added data sets can then be shared at will with other authenticated users, so who are writing a paper together, etc. But what is most important that we can bring in new data sets, which are these self-contained data sets at a linear cost, because we don't build the combinatorial links ourselves. Okay, so this enabled us to grow extremely quickly. So one of the examples is, for example, a project by Tamás Budavári and Michael Braverman, who was the former housing commissioner of Baltimore City. Baltimore has 17,000 abandoned houses, and some of them need to be torn down, others needs to be repaired. And this was an incredibly complicated optimization problem. So Tamás and Michael actually and students brought in the city map and built a very detailed map of all these challenges, and then came up with a machine learning and AI algorithm that actually performed the optimizations, which in such a way that actually the experts, this city decision makers bought into it. So this is a case, for example, when this actually provided tangible benefits for a broader community. Another of our projects is trying to do a 2.5 petabyte ocean circulation model. And we need to do much more in situ computation right on top of the data. And we are basically exploring DESC or using DESC to go parallel within Jupyter. And this is the project I even referred to in the title, AstroPath, which is astronomy with pathology. So building a very large scale cancer cell atlas. And this is the project with Jenny Staub, who is a professor in the dermatology department and part of the Bloomberg Kimmel Center for Immunotherapy at JHU. And so the goal is to study the tumor microenvironment to understand the interaction, how the immune system interacts with individual cancer cells, and which of these immune cells are capable of attacking the cancer, and how can they be stimulated or blocked. And in order to do this, the goal is to take immense amounts of data. So we are looking at really we are going to look at thousands of patients and many billions of cells. So basically, instead of this is just one of these tissue samples. This across is about a few millimeters across, maybe half a centimeter. And normally people have taken a couple of high resolution images, roughly at 1500 by 1500 resolution. And one of those little rectangles here shows one of those images. And we took the SkyServer approach, that instead of just taking 5 or 10 isolated spots, okay, we said, let's cover the whole thing with an overlapping mosaic, just like Sloan covered the whole sky. And so one image is a 400 gigabyte mosaic, one whole slide image of 35 narrowband images. And we have to put this together into a spatially coherent data sets. And so currently in our sample, we have 80 million cells with precise geometry. We computed nearest neighbors like we computed for galaxies. We have all the tumor boundaries defined. And we created an interactive viewer just like the SciServer. We have 6 robotic microscopes just installed, which have the capability of getting about 3 petabytes of data over the next 12 months. The database is linked to the SciServer. And Akoya Biosciences, which is manufacturing the microscopes, is getting really excited about this. This is a close-up view when we zoom in on the individual cells. So each of the cells actually has both the membrane and the nucleus stored as a GIS polygon. And we are using basically a GIS library to visualize all of that. But everything can be colored basically by phenotypes and so on. So lessons learned. Statistical analysis and collaboration is much easier with the database than with the hundreds of thousands or millions of flat files kind of scattered around a lot of servers. Collaborative features are essential. We need to go beyond SQL, and Jupyter and deep learning are kind of the trendy things that everyone wants to use. Everything is spatial. No matter whether we look at astronomy, cancer, turbulence, oceans, material science, social science, everywhere people want spatial features, very detailed spatial correlations. To be reproducible at scale, we need to automate. We have to take the humans out of the loop, partly because of the error-prone nature of human interactions, and other is the scalability. The human manpower is expensive. All in all, scaling out in all of these projects was much harder than we ever thought. We are getting better at it, but it's still a challenge. One of the key lessons was do not try to do everything for everybody. Sorry, a typo there. So we had to find a trade-off. So trade-off is the keyword here. So basically, try to do the 20% of all the things that you can do, which will actually make 80% of your users happy. Whether it's 10 or 90 or so, that depends. But Jim came up with a wonderful heuristic way to using the 20 queries approach. I don't want to go into that. But besides, providing the shrink wrap data, which is, we also always need to keep the deep links to the raw data, because if we find something unusual, we have to be able to determine whether this was not an instrumental artifact. We have to find a common processing level that is good enough. We don't have to do 11 in the spinal tap sense. We have to do something that is 8 or 9. But we have to earn the trust of the community. We must not change it. We have to provide a stable interface, a stable data. And the last bit that we also learned the hard way, moving petabytes of data is hard, especially when you want to aggregate things. There is a very important role for smart data caching, which leads me to the OSN. So this is a project that started a few years ago. The idea is that the NSF spent a lot of money on the computational and the networking infrastructure for the country, but very little for data. And there were 150 universities connected at 40 to 100 gig speeds. Yet when we tried to transfer even a few terabytes of data, it was going much slower because there were multiple firewalls along the way and so on, and misconfigured disk subsystems. So the idea is that in every one of these universities, there is actually a networking rack outside the university firewall, which is capable of receiving data at 100 gig speeds at wire speed. And the problems are between that closet and the rest of the university. So what if we could build actually a storage appliance, which is of the order of 100K and the storage capacity of 1.5 petabytes, and then put down a rack on every one of these sites next to the networking hub, and store much of the NSF generated data, maybe provide shared storage for the big data hub communities, distribute the data from MREFC projects like the LSST, and also provide gateways and caches to the large supercomputers and between the universities and even the cloud providers. And people said, no, this cannot be done. So actually, Eric Schmidt gave us enough money to actually build a couple of prototype nodes and show that we can build such a half a rack of computers which have 1.5 petabytes. They actually can saturate the wire speed at 100 gigs off of the disk, and they cost 120K. And this is, of course, going to get cheaper and cheaper. So from 20 million, we could actually build a system of 100 nodes. So then at that point, the NSF stepped in. We built a 6-node testbed, which is working and functional, and now others are joining. So various big projects are buying the hardware, and this. So this is going on. But here's now, I'm coming to the sociological part of the talk in the last bit. So the era of surveys has another implication. So we are moving from the era of manufacturing scientific data in small experiments to the industrial revolution of big science. And this happened in particle physics probably 20 years earlier. So we went from the Van de Graafs at the turn of the century to cyclotrons, synchrotrons, stational labs. And then the question was what will happen, whether the SSC, where a single country tried to build step to the next level, and it was just too expensive, so it didn't happen, or will it be done like the LHC, when actually almost all the countries in the world got together to build a large experiment. So basically, big science projects are entering the multi-billion-dollar regime, where the open data archives are organized by large communities. But this causes a big difference downstream. So in the past, when we had small experiments, they were rapidly followed by another one experiment, which was incrementally a little bit better. The data sets had a short lifetime because the next experiment superseded it. But when we have these multi-billion-dollar experiments, they may not be surpassed by another in our lifetimes. So the data is here to stay for 50 years because it will not be repeated. So what goes? And there's a lot of talk about FAIR, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reproducible. So how about free and sustainable, adding to these requirements? So there is an increasing expectation for open and free access. And what happens, and nobody knows what happens to the large high-value data sets when the experiments are completed. So there are these three factors, free, accessible, and sustainable. They are very much like these three legs of project management. So the cost, features, and timeline. And so there is a saying that pick any two and the third is determined. So basically, if it's a closed system and we want free and accessible, then it is not sustainable. Somebody has to pay for it, pay for keeping the data accessible. Or if it is free and sustainable, this probably means copying the data on disk and leaving it alone. So it's not really accessible. So how can one ensure a steady long-term support? And who do we trust with all this data? And how can we decide what to preserve? So we need a new trusted intermediary who takes over from the projects when they are sunset. But building trust is hard and losing it is easy. So what goes? So it's worthwhile thinking about the long-term data life cycles. So long-term life cycle, there's not only a data life cycle, but there's service life cycle where the data is presented in services, the browsers change, OS change, new software platforms emerge, and disks die. This picture shows all the disks that are dead coming off of the Sloan archive and our data center. So it is 1,800 drives, 1.1 tons of hard disks. And this only represents actually a very modest 2.5% failure rate over 18 years. You can see the scale. This is the easiest problem to solve, but this is still bad enough. So it's worthwhile thinking about the economics of this a little. What is the value of the data? How can we estimate what is the value of accessible survey or experimental data? Basically, it accelerates text testing ideas, provides platform for reproducibility, and basically provides direct foundation to many papers. So basically, one way to translate this into dollars is that how much science funding does a data set attract? When people spend their own NSF grants or research grants that they could spend on anything they want on actually analyzing this data set. So a typical NSF astronomy grant is about $300,000 over 3 years. So 2 refereed papers is a good performance. So this implies roughly that 50K per paper is good. And with kind of less rounded to about 100K per paper. So it's certainly not 10,000 and it's not 1 million. So this is a good fiducial number. 100K per paper is a good value of measuring the relevance of a data set. What is the price of data? Price is what it takes to produce. So it's for a big experiment, Sloan 1 through 4 was about probably 200 million total. LSST will be about 1 billion. LHC is probably going to be 10 billion. So one can compare this price of data compared to the value versus the output. So Sloan enabled 9,000 refereed papers. So this is roughly equivalent to 900 million in terms of value. And it costs only 200 million. So that's actually very efficient. But there is a third component. What is the cost of data? And the cost means that actually the ongoing cost of maintaining the data, preserving the data. And this is mostly in people and not the price of the disks. So far it has been good because we were maintaining the data as part of live projects and we were collecting more data. But this is about to change. The first surveys are coming to an end. Sloan Pan-STARRS Dark Energy Survey. What happens to the data? Who will take ownership of it? Who will remember what it is? Who will pay for it? And the estimated cost for Sloan is about 500K per year. So this is either 5 papers written per year on the data or a quarter of the percentage of the price of the data. So basically a 5 cost overrun in the survey, overall survey cost, which is a modest contingency fund, would cover the data services for 20 years out. So how do we do the scalable data access and analysis? Traditionally, we threw our data over the wall and the scientific publishers caught it, put it in the paper and handled it for a fee and claimed copyright. This no longer works. The data is too much for the journal publishers. We need active curated services and nobody is willing to sign the data rights over to commercial entities. So the traditional models are collapsing as well. So in music, we used to buy the LPs and CDs, take it home and listen to them. Then we actually could download them one song at a time. And now we are streaming. We don't even know what the next song is going to be in a way. And so the data equivalent was that we downloaded all the data and carried it home and then ran it on our workstation. The next one, the iTunes equivalent, is that we run SQL queries to the databases where we actually download home the subset of the data that we need. And basically when we run in the cloud and stream the result, that is the Pandora and Spotify of scientific data analysis. And this is happening, you know, it's inevitable. It's right in front of us. So what happens to our data in 30 years? Today, we spend billions to acquire valuable data. Much of this will not be superseded in our lifetimes. At the end of the projects, the data sets will be handed off to someone because the project organizations are going to be dismantled. So we need an organization that has a long track record with a predictable future. Okay, so what is the longest existing organization on the planet? It's probably the Catholic Church, but they are not into data. So we need to think about also the ones that understand data preservation. They are trusted by everyone, they are technically capable, can run under a sustainable model and have no single points of failure. So where is the Smithsonian for digital data? This is the problem that we need to solve, that where our data sets are the equivalent of the physical specimen of the Hope Diamond in the Smithsonian. And they are just as precious. So machine learning is coming. So I'm about done. So just a few pictures. Andy may remember some of these slides. It started all with photometric redshift and PCAs of spectra and so on. And today we have gone actually, the Google Brain team found new exoplanets that the traditional astronomy analysis have missed. But scalability and aggregation for scientists is still a problem. How do we do machine learning over billions of points when even half of a few billion points are in the Amazon cloud, the other half is in the Google cloud? Who can pay for the egress, ingress, egress fees and the data transfers? So what can we do? And here is an idea. I'm running out of time. So basically we just wrote a paper with Viscave, Nick Ifkin, Bova Braverman, that how can one do actually a geo-clustering geo-separated billions of points and using a count sketch data structure, where one can do this linear time and logarithmic memory finding the high density clusters in the data and just using it as a sparse representation of the statistical data distribution and do all our statistics on this. And we can do this in the separate data locations separately and then just aggregate the sketches, which are logarithmically smaller. So there's the archive link, but it's linear time and logarithmic space. So the last bit is priority. If I asked any one of you, do you have enough data or would you like to have more? Everybody would say that I want more data. But actually, this is a trick question, and it's the wrong answer. The right answer is it depends. Everybody thinks when they hear this or see this question that I want more of the data that is relevant to me. But it doesn't mean, but if I phrase the question that would you like to have just more junk data mixed in with your little bit of good data, nobody would say that I want more of that. So there is a delicate trade-off between the scientific value and the cost of acquisition and preservation. So one extreme, if we collect and store everything, we go bankrupt and there is no science. The other extreme, there is too little data, there is not enough for science. So what is the sweet spot? And the particle physicists, the RHC has thought a lot about this over the last few decades. And so they have these multiple experiments that tap into the beamlines, and then they have hardware triggers that filter the data, and they only keep 1 out of 10 million events. And it took a decade to define these thresholds, and the resulting subset is analyzed afterwards. But the key lesson is that a generalized 90-10 rule. So the 90% of the science value is carried by 10% of the data, or is it 999 to 1, or is it 9999999 to 1? Every project has to determine this trade-off by itself, but without the trade-off, we will die. We will not be able to do the next experiment. So what is next? And this is, I think, one very promising area where AI basically might actually kick in. And so let me actually jump to here. Okay. So instead of more data, we need more relevant data, and we need dramatically improve the experimental design, use AI before we collect the data. And then here is a project that we actually got funding from Eric Schmidt to try to put the telescope into the rapid reinforcement loop and into doing reinforcement learning in both targets, in which targets do we select. Finishing up, in 8 to 10 years, everything is commoditized, everything is accelerating except the universities. You may laugh, but this is, I mean this in a good sense. So, when actually there is this mad rush forward in doing the next technological buzz, it's sometimes good that at the university there are people who actually sit back and relax and think deeply about the fundamentals, the foundation of deep learning and so on, where actually in the industry there is sometimes no time. It is clear that everything is going to be in the cloud, partly due to the economies of scale, partly due to the accelerated development. And what will be the machine learning in science when the hype settles? We need to use physical insight, physics-infused machine learning, explainable inference, discover sparse representations, proxy simulations, and many experiments will be driven by AI. We will always need trusted intermediaries between us and the data and trusted data sets. So summary, open big data is at the forefront. Convergence, disruptive changes will keep happening whether we like it or not. We improvise much of the data strategy as it happened by adapting to changes as they arose, because it was quite unpredictable. Funding was much slower and mostly reactive, and we are spending today billions of experiments, yet we have no plan for long-term data, and we have to improvise again. So this is where I sit right now. And the challenge is that we need to come up with answers. How can we make our adaptation more agile? So how can we actually move faster? How can we steer towards long-term sustainability? Who is the trusted intermediary that will deal with the data? And how can we reinvent ourselves over and over? So I'd like to show a Lewis Carroll quote to finish up, which kind of describes my life. It takes all the running, and all my life I've been running as fast as I can, and it is still not enough. I actually realize I have to run twice. I should have run twice as fast. Thank you very much. Not even through this talk, but.
Thank you, Alex. That was a really great talk. We're going to have a few questions. I'm going to just read the questions from the Q&A. And if other people have other questions that they want to ask Alex, just add them directly into the Q&A. So the first one was about the opportunities for developing parallel algorithms, and in particularly targeted at high performance computing and environments. And the question is, can you elaborate more on what algorithms do you think might be worth accelerating, given the the new generation of data?
Well, so I think one obvious thing is to do the simulations in a completely different way. So think about, again, the LHC beamlines. So because as the petascale or the exascale computers emerge, basically, we will not be able to dump the snapshots from the simulations as we do. So we have to do pretty much everything or almost everything in situ. So right now we think about a big simulation, for example, on these big supercomputers as a sequence of snapshots. But rather we should think about as discrete localized events. Most of the simulation is boring, but there are some places where there is something fundamentally exciting happening while we are doing the simulations. How could we actually do simultaneously spending 10% of the course to actually run a machine learning, pattern recognition, deep learning to find actually when something unusual and unpredictable is happening and store those discrete localized events. Especially so because more of the next generation supercomputers will have also a neuromorphic hardware layer. So they will have actually probably TPU chips and so on, which are not so suitable to perform, partial differential equations, but they are perfect for pattern recognition and convolution of kernels. And then basically then create a stream of these events and store those events, which can then be analyzed in a random access fashion afterwards. And I can see whole communities getting together on piggybacking on a single simulation. So that one group will study clusters of galaxies, another will study galaxy formation, the third one will observe Lyman alpha clouds, all in the same simulation that will take probably $100 million to run. So this is where I see ourselves 5 years from now, and which integrates the new hardware, the new software, and the new way of doing science and the new data management. But that's outside the box, though. So.
And then a question from Gus Everard, which was, what might the role be of academic societies in the long-term curation of data collections?
So in a sense, bring the overarching owner of the data, probably. They don't necessarily want to run the data archives themselves, but they could play a role in, for example, deciding which of the data sets should stay in kind of hot storage, high priority data sets, which are the ones which should be kind of migrated slowly to the, so create a consensus about which are the data sets that could be migrated towards more cold storage and so on, because not the usage of this will fluctuate, change over time. Nice.
All right, thanks, Alex. And a question from Mario Juric, which is about RDBMSs, so databases, and how do you actually do large-scale analysis with databases when you have to do the analysis across the whole or a very large data set? So a lot of the work that's been going on recently has been interested in things like Spark and Dask, which are essentially map-reduced type analytics that allow you to iterate over large amounts of data. And are there changes or improvements in the database community to support these?
Ask Google. So the database community wrote papers why you cannot have very large scale content or global scale distributed databases. And then Google just did it. So they solved the problem. And in a sense, so much of the Google doesn't have a file system anymore. So it's all in databases. So I think there are database technologies around actually where this whole concurrency and the very large scale distributed nature, as in my mind, it has been solved.
But does this mean we have to buy into the Google versions of the databases, or is there a place for SciServer?
No, I think in a sense this will also kind of gradually migrate into the public domain. So there will be equivalents of Spanner and so on in publicly. And so I don't think this will, so for science, we can do these things which is big enough. And even for all of LSSD, much of the core of the LSSD data today would fit on a single database server with SSD disks. So the hardware is also evolving so quickly. I mean, all of the Sloan data can now sit essentially on a laptop today. We have big enough SSDs that fit on, or close to it. So I never imagined such a rapid change. So.
Okay, and so being cognizant of the time, I'm going to ask one more question, or take one more question, and then I'm going to pass it back to Sarah, who's going to tell us who the next speaker in the seminar series is. So I'll take the next in line, which is in the context of oncology. How do the methods you've been talking about complement or extend upon the high spatial data analysis and storage for multiplexed images that are present in oncology?
Well, so the way we handle the segmented data. So typically people have recorded cells as a single dot with no spatial extent. They didn't really have the tools to study, for example, which cells are in contact with each other. So actually resolve the polygon intersections, or when are two polygons representing the membranes of the cell touching each other, which is at the core of understanding the immune cell and tumor interactions. So what we need to see is, okay, when a tumor cell is, for example, also expressed in certain proteins, the PD-L1, you can see it now in all the TV advertisements that kind of advertise immunotherapy drugs, PD-1, PD-L1, and so on, and then look at matching immune cells and which are the T cells that have been activated. So it makes all the difference. And also, people have been doing the analysis on spreadsheets of the data and manually picking up the neighboring cells and counting them and then putting them manually into spreadsheets and doing the statistical analysis that way. This is not scalable.
Okay, thank you, Alex. And we all give you a huge virtual round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It has been a pleasure. And thank you very much, everyone.
So I'm going to turn it back to Sarah, who can tell us about the next speaker.
Great. Thanks, Andy. And thank you, Alex. And I'll just remind everyone that Alex's talk will be available online on YouTube if you want to watch it again or point it to your colleagues. Our next speaker in the Data Science Coast to Coast series will be Jean Holm, who's the Chief Data Officer for the City of Los Angeles. That talk is coming up on December 15th at 3 p.m. Eastern and noon Pacific. And hope you all can join us. And thanks again, Alex, for your talk today. Really enjoyed it and great audience questions. So thank you all. See you soon.
Yeah, thank you very much, everyone.